Hello, this is the Chapter 1 overview video with some of the highlights from Chapter 1 and some things that'll be on the Module 1 exam later on, and I'll be posting these along with each chapter. What is mass communication? So mass communication is any kind of communication that is enhanced by technology. If you think about the printing press with books and newspapers and magazines, it's one of the earliest ways of communicating with a mass audience. And the technology was the printing press. A quick distinction, mass media are the technologies that we use to communicate, but mass communication are those messages, the articles that were written, or the songs that we're downloading from iTunes, or the movies that we're watching. Mass communication is defined by some as creating shared meaning between the mass media and the audiences. So we're creating something together. The media informs our culture, and our culture informs the media. If you think about it, we are doing this all day long. We've got these devices in our hands and in our pockets, and we are communicating and absorbing information and then putting out information that is circular nature of our modern day mass communication. That creates our culture. Our media helps create our culture, and it more than helps, it kind of is part of our culture. Media shapes who we are. Are we spoon-fed by the media, or are we truly unique individuals? If we're honest, we can admit that we are who we are based on our context, the country we live in, the media we consume, the friends we have. As individualistic as we like to think of ourselves, we are a reflection of all those things. If you think about our culture in this country, if you've ever been overseas or just absorbed media from other countries, they're different. They consume different media, and it has that same circular relationship in every culture. And communication is how we socially interact with the world around us through messages. We're always communicating. Even when we're not communicating, we're communicating. For instance, when we're silent, we are communicating. Particularly in a relationship, silence communicates a very strong message. But it is, in fact, a communication. We can't not communicate. We can communicate ineffectively, and I can miscommunicate a message, but that doesn't mean I've not communicated. We are always communicating. Sometimes it's missed cues or fake news or some other kind of mistake along the way, but we're still communicating. So are we aware that we're being influenced, and how can we tell? So a lot of times we think other people are influenced by the media, but not me, not my political party, not my religious group or whatever else. But when in fact, we're all just as guilty of these things as anybody else. Just really quickly thinking about a few forms of communication. I like that the book covers this. Intrapersonal communication is what's going on in our head. And if you think about it, that is the foundation. That conversation you have in your own head is the foundation of all of the ways you then go on and communicate with other people or with large groups or in the mass media. And then interpersonal between a few people, group communication, like say in a classroom discussion, and then mass communication using technology to communicate outside of that smaller group. So communication is when an individual or institution uses technology, and then you have to have a large audience. How large? That's a tough question to answer because it's not defined. If I were to go right now on Facebook and do a Facebook Live video, and I had 5 people watching my Facebook Live video, I'm using technology, but I don't know that that's a large enough audience to say that I'm communicating in the mass media, or I'm using mass communication. Now, if Drake does that, does a live video, I don't know he does that, but somebody famous, and they've got thousands or millions of viewers, sure, that's definitely using mass communication at that point. But it's interesting how everything is changing. Social media can be both personal communication and mass communication. So this guy came up with one of the first simple definitions of mass communication, or at least the process that takes place. And he spells out these 4 things: that there's a sender who came up with the message, there is the message that they are sending, the channel through which they are sending that message, and then the receiver. So if you think about how did you get information about the COVID virus this week? say some news organization, NBC News, posted an article online with some interviews. So on NBCnews.com, there's a website, and that was the way they communicated it. But then that got to you through social media. So there's kind of two channels being used now already. And you receive that message. And if we look at that on like a chart, here's what that looks like. We call this the transition model. And it's just kind of a simple, somewhat dated now way of thinking about how the communication process works. What I find interesting about this is it is the simplest way we can think about how we're communicating our message. So right now I'm the source. I'm using technology, Camtasia software, and a cam that follows me around when I'm walking around here. That is the technology that I'm using, but I'm sending it to you through a channel, which is eLearn and YouTube. So multiple channels being used now to communicate that message. And you are the receivers. The question I have is, am I having any effect on you? And that's what I like about this model, is it demands that we look at the effect, because that's the goal. We don't communicate for no reason. We communicate to have an effect. I notice sometimes my students will make a music video, or even students in like a creative writing class, they write a poem and they're like, I don't want to share it with anybody. That defeats the purpose of writing the poem. These things are, we create art, we create communication to have an effect on people. Sometimes the effect isn't what we wanted. They may laugh at you. Can you live with that? My lecture might bore you to tears. That's not the effect I want. I'm trying to make it good. But that is sometimes the outcome, and we need to look at that, engage our next communication based on, okay, they were certainly bored, I could tell. In class, I can tell. When there's heads down on the desk and snoring, then I'm not communicating very well. If people are engaged and having feedback and paying attention, then I know they are communicating. Back and forth, they're listening. I'm having the desired effect. How do I tell in this format if you guys are understanding and paying attention? So I could ask some questions. I could say, hey, what'd you get out of that lecture? It's going to be hard. I'm struggling with figuring that out. But I can also tell, like, okay, how many people actually watched the video and how much of the video did they look at? I don't want to do all that. I hope it's engaging enough that you'll want to watch that. Another interesting thing is there is something called noise. Noise is anything that interferes with our message. So if I am teaching in the classroom and the fire alarm goes off in the hallway, that is a literal noise, but it's also a noise that impacts my message that I'm trying to share. So we're gonna have to stop class and go out for a fire drill or possible fire, but that interrupts the message. Noise could also be, it's a beautiful day outside and people are looking out the windows and they're wanting to go outside and do something awesome, and you're stuck in a classroom. That is interfering with my message. The other thing about noise is it could be the way in which you communicate a message. So like if somebody's very monotonous and boring in a classroom, that's gonna lull you to sleep, and that's not a great way to communicate a message. I usually do this in class. I'm not sure what this camera's gonna do right now, but if I stand on the desk, which is usually pretty intimidating for the person in the front row on the first day of class, if I stand up here and lecture, that is going to totally freak out your interpretation of my message. I'm still saying the same things, but the fact that I'm doing it in a different format may not be the right, appropriate format, and that causes noise in our message. So what does it mean to have shared meaning? Well, there's certain things we all understand, and we get that from our mass media. What does it mean when somebody, say, holds up their middle finger to you in traffic? We know what that means because we've learned what that means from our society. What is a poop emoji, or any of the other weird ways in which we communicate today? We have shared meaning based on our cultural understanding of all these things. If you look at television, we watch advertisements. Advertisements hit on things like Buy American. So Chevy trucks are all about freedom. Axe shower gel is going to make young guys cooler than they would be without it. Look at the music recording industry. They're getting feedback by dropping an album, and how many album sales do they have, or how many single sales of single songs do they get on iTunes, or how much is Spotify or Pandora willing to pay for a contract with an artist like Taylor Swift. In film, we react to stories, and then we give feedback with our dollars, kind of vote with our dollars. So did we like the Avengers Endgame or Get Out or whatever movie we used to get to see in theaters? Hopefully we will again. And then how do we give feedback interpersonally? So in TV, radio, and film, it's a little different, and that's where this model doesn't do well. It doesn't capture that ongoing process. So they updated the model, and these researchers, Osgood and Schramm, came up with a cyclical model where we're constantly coding and decoding messages, and that's happening all the time. Talked about students in the classroom are listening or they're goofing off. Same thing going on at home. So this kind of captures a little better what's happening when we're communicating. But mass communication is even more complex than that. We're creating shared meaning, and we're getting what's called inferential feedback through the mass media. So if we're broadcasting a television show, we don't instantly know how people are reacting to it. So they came up with this even more complex model. I like that they try to look at, okay, you put out a message through various different medium, and then we have to look at all the different ways it's being interpreted by different audiences sometimes. So people are watching broadcast television, some people are watching shows on DVR, some people are only watching things when they finally drop on Netflix. There's a lot of different ways that people are engaging with your content and with your message, but it's not as easy as just a conversation where I know immediately what's happening. Which, by the way, for television, we have Nielsen ratings. So TV executives don't get the numbers right away, but we do 4 times a year these ratings that capture what people watch for 2 weeks during sweeps week, and we find out, okay, that was very popular. It is a little easier on Netflix though, like if everybody's talking about the new season of Stranger Things or Orange is the New Black or whatever, The Umbrella Academy, whatever's on Netflix, if it got binge watched the weekend it dropped, that's huge, and they know right away. So it's exciting through newer media to have more direct feedback. The last few things here, in more recent years, they start talking about the symbolic process through which we communicate. If you think about it, symbols are very important. This English language that we use is composed of 26 letters and a few forms of punctuation, and that's all we have for all of this type of communication. And when we are born, usually in this country, we start learning English. So we start learning that code. People in other countries are learning other codes. So if you look at Chinese or Japanese, their language consists of thousands and thousands of little pictures. And those pictures are the code that those people tend to think in. Just like right now, you're thinking in your brain, do I like this lecture or not? But you're probably thinking that in English, unless you're an English as a second language learner, and then you're thinking of it in your native language. So codes are very important, and symbols and codes of how our brains work. And if you think about it, it's like a different operating system. It's like a whole other way of understanding. You can still do the same kinds of things, but it might be a different process of getting there. The last thing here is James Carey's definition in 1989 talked about these fragile cultures and the fact that we're all communicating together and it's a sacred ceremony. It's a lot. I'm not crazy about that definition, but I do like that it captures this idea that perception is reality, and what we think about the world going on around us is as important as what is really going on. So sometimes you see, particularly in our social media today, all this communication about these certain topics that may not even be true, and they're kind of just deflecting us sometimes from what maybe we really should be thinking about is going on in the world. One of the effects that our media has on our society is creating a mainstream, which people misuse this idea of mainstream media sometimes. We'll talk about that more. But just the dominant culture. White, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant men have been in control of our country for a long, long time. Look at all of our presidents, except for 44. We have had white men in charge of institutions and in charge of government and the private sector. And it is changing, but our media are reflecting some of that change and encouraging some of that change, but also reinforcing some of the stereotypes. So those are some of the highlights from chapter 1. I hope that's helpful to hear and see some of this being discussed. And go ahead and do the assignments. Let me know if you have any questions online. I'll see you next time.